Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us. We're less than a week away from CISO Forum Canada. And just before that, we've got the Collegiate Penetration Testing Competition and we've got the Career Expo. Today, my discussion is going to focus less on the technicalities of cybersecurity, less on the day to day operations of cybersecurity. We're not going to talk about technology and process. We're going to be talking about people. You've often heard me say this PPT, people, process, technology, and to quote Mark Dillon, in that order. How do we understand people and personalities in the world of cybersecurity? My guest today is someone that if you look her up and you go on to her profile on LinkedIn, her cover page picture is something that will truly show you the reality of her personality. She says, good is bad, bad is good, terrible is an opportunity. Terrible is awesome. You see, where people settle for stasis, where people settle for the status quo, they often don't know what lies beyond them. My guest today is someone that will help you look at your technical skills in cybersecurity and help you understand what lies beyond. My name is Ali Hirji. I'm the lead of the Cyber Exchange Advisory. I also work and teach at Durham College's AI Hub and Center for Cybersecurity Innovation. How many times have you heard the line, in God we trust, everybody else must bring data? My guest today is going to bring you a boat full of data. Her name is Ayesha Zubair. She leads a bunch of initiatives at Royal Bank Canada. She is one of the most important figures that I know, at least at RBC, and someone that I had the opportunity of going to school with. She often didn't believe that I would graduate. I somehow did, or at least I pretend that I did. And I'm here, and it's an honor to have her as my guest. Her name is Ayesha Zubair. Ayesha, welcome to the Power Hour.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Now, Ayesha, I know that when someone looks at your repertoire and everything that you've done, you've not necessarily spent a dedicated amount of time in the world of cybersecurity, but
Mhm.
you've had a lot to do in the world of design and a lot to do in recruitment. Your career has taken you from recruitment to HR roles and now to leading insights and transformation and really working on design, but driven by data.
Mhm.
If you're going to bring data, let's have a discussion. If you're going to go with opinion, let's just go with mine. You focused a lot on working with data. Aisha, can you tell us a little bit about your career and how has data been at the centrality of it?
Sure. So I started, right out of school. I kind of joined the workforce, and I was really focused on. I was like, okay, I'm an HR professional. I graduated in HR, therefore I must work in HR. And so, I started my career within HR. I never really saw myself as a numbers person, right? So if you had asked me, Ali, like when we went to school, if you had asked me, like, are you ever going to work with data? I would tell you absolutely not. Like, I'm not a numbers person, can't do it, don't want to do it. But when I got to the workforce, what I realized pretty quickly is that it it's data is just how you function, right? And it's not necessarily about numbers as much as it's about logic. It's about logical thinking. It's about thinking about how do we do things with evidence, right? Like, we want to make sure that what we are doing is not just someone's conceptualization or opinion. We want to be able to deliver value for our stakeholders. And so how do we do that? And the easiest way to do that is really to rely on data. So I came by data honestly. And then as I started doing more of that work, I was like, this is fascinating, right?
Yeah.
And it's not at all what I thought it would be. So I got deeper and deeper into it. And I ended up sort of going from just analysis of data to actually being a I was analyst for a while within HR, but looking at our people data. And then I kind of got to a place where I was like, okay, well, if we know this now, we kind of need to do a better job. So we can sit on the receiving end on the reactive side and sort of crunch some numbers and maybe tell a smaller story. But how do we now then get to a point where we actually actively collect data in from sources like we've never collected before? So I kind of got more on the I got more exposure to sentiment analysis
Yeah.
and trying to understand more machine learning and just getting a little more deeper and into more some of the more mature sources of data. um, and so and spent some time up for a couple of years just before this role just doing some more work around actually using sentiment analysis and machine learning data to understand how we design programs within our HR world.
Let's work with that just a little bit, because I know that our audience today, you're going to have folks who are executives who might be thinking about their next position. You've got some folks who are running their own gigs. You've got quite a few graduate students who are also listening. One of the fundamental questions that they have is what's happening at the other end of the table when you're in that process of getting hired or you're in that process of interviewing for a position. Now, a lot of students and a lot of individuals, professional students alike, have got a variety of classifications, have got a variety of skill sets. They bring a lot of certifications to the table. Some of them bring a bag full of them, some have a couple of them, justifying them in different ways. Can you talk to us a little bit? Is that when you're hiring for technical roles, and you've done that in cybersecurity as well, how do you look at the data of a candidate? Is it just how many education attainments do they have? Is it the experience? Is it a numbers game? Is it a subjective thing? How should a cybersecurity professional looking to convince an HR individual that they are the right person for the next phase, how should they be thinking about presenting their data to someone like yourself?
So I think, the important thing is the certification and sort of the more formal educations are, of course, really important, but it's also about how you talk about them, right? How you position them. So what we want to, my advice to you would be to think about telling some stories, right? Make it real for us. So you've done some really great formal education. What did you do with it after that? Right. So tell me an example. Tell me an example of the results you've accomplished. Tell me about a time where that particular education or experience really led to some real business results. And that's so people often then say to me, well, that's fine and dandy if we are going to do that in an interview, but how do I even get that story across before that? So I always say to candidates, just generally, and whoever I'm speaking to about sort of hiring and recruitment, is think I mean, you have very powerful tools at your disposal.
Yeah.
Right? So everybody talks about the resume, so and that's a given, right? So within your resume, instead of telling me about or telling a recruiter, whoever you're giving that resume to, instead of telling them about what you did in a particular role or in a particular project, talk about what you accomplished in that project, right? Like, how did you add value in that? And so think about it from the STAR acronym. So what was the situation? Tell me about the situation, then tell me about how you achieved those results, and what were the results. So actually get to numbers, add your numbers in, right? So improved performance by how many, what percent, what was the difference in all of that? So talk about it there, but also don't forget you have LinkedIn, right? And think of LinkedIn like resume is like prime real estate, right? So you only want to mention things that are going to be relevant for the position that you're applying for. You don't want to mention every single thing that you've ever done, because I'm sure that there's some very qualified people out there, and we've all done a lot sometimes, right? So we can't mention every single thing in a resume. Resume has to be brief. It's like your highlight reel. But use your LinkedIn. That's the place where you can really, really like get that extra information out there. Tell your stories. Publish if you can. Right. Be a thought leader in your field. If you've really done, if you guys have all done sort of, I've heard, it's a talented crowd. So to show that expertise. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be all that, but it just helps recruiters get a sense of who you are, how you think, and how you achieve results.
As you mentioned, there's a very talented and diverse audience that's listening to us. And again, a shout out to the CyberX team for bringing in all the questions to me on one stream. So Aisha, I'll as I always like to do, sometimes I weave in the questions, sometimes I just sort of microwave them all in together and see what comes out of it. So we'll just go with the flow and see where we land. I do see a question that has come up, and I feel like while it's not true to my form to bring it up this early, I do want to bring it up right now. And that is this aspect of, yes, you've mentioned a lot about Make sure that you're presenting your resume in a certain way. You've highlighted certain certifications that you may have, like CISSP, CEH, whatever else have you, but back it up with context, back it up with additional links that people may be going to, so on and so forth.
Absolutely.
But there's also the reality that just as much as you want somebody to get to know you, you need to get to know them, because when you're at that interview point, you're actually trying to get to know them better and see if they are a fit for you. You remember that quote in Suits, right? Like, it's not bragging if it's true. If you've done certain things and you can prove it, the interview is your chance to get to know more about the company. How do you go about doing that kind of search? How do you get, what's the best way to know more about if RBC is looking, for example, for a cybersecurity analyst, and I need to know more about RBC's needs or any company's needs? What do I do in that case? What are some tips that you can provide?
So I think in any company, in any sort of company, right? Like it doesn't matter which company we're talking about, the interview and the recruitment process is the tip of the iceberg. That's like at that moment, like that's just a very small part of the recruitment process, I would say. That's the formal recruitment process. Don't forget to tap into that bottom layer, that bottom of the iceberg, right? Which is the informal recruitment process. And what I mean by that is like, don't you have, again, like I said, right? You have an incredible tool at your disposal, LinkedIn. Reach out to people.
Right.
That's the best. Reach out ahead of time, right? Like before, if you've determined that you are interested in a particular company, um, reach out to folks. Most folks will be very happy to chat with you. That's a really good way of trying to get to understand what it's like to work there, understand the culture, know if you're going to be a fit. And the one thing I will say from the recruitment side of things is that, you know, it's also in the employer's best interest to give you a realistic job preview, right? So, or the most honest or authentic view into what it's like to work, because if you're not happy, you're going to leave. And so that's from a, like, again, I'll go back to the data, right? From an ROI perspective, that's not good for us either as an employer. So because there a lot of cost goes into hiring somebody. I think the industry average, or just the general average, the stat I've seen on that is around 12,000, 10 to 12,000 per hire. So that they've made an investment. If they're hiring you, they've made an investment in you. They're likely to want to give you the best idea of what it's like to work there too.
Yep. And I think that takes us into a very different dimension when it comes to this discussion around HR, recruiting, data, and cybersecurity. We also have folks, for example, we have the Phelps group that does a lot of executive searches. We have other folks who focus on bringing talent to different companies on contracts and permanent positions, so on and so forth. I think folks forget also that for a person like yourself who's specialized in data and insights, both in the HR and the design world, you've also had to grapple with a new reality around the gaps in cybersecurity. And I want to unpack that just a little bit. Sherlock Holmes says, right, is that any theorizing without data is a capital flaw, which simply means that you have to look at the data and you have to draw insight from it in order to determine what kind of cybersecurity positions need to be posted and how to position for them, so on and so forth. As you can see, and Ayesha, thank you for sharing some of that data with us, and thanks to CyberX team. For all of our audience, you'll see in the ticker down below, there's a lot of data down there that's showing you about where the cybersecurity jobs are going to be in 2021 and what the gaps are going to be in that. Ayesha, you've been in this space since 2015, and the boom in cybersecurity requirements and the boom in hiring is something you've had to contend with. How have you, as an HR professional, understood the world of cybersecurity and the requirements when it comes to hiring?
Yeah, so I wouldn't. So I'm not a specialist in the cybersecurity recruitment field specifically,
Yeah.
but I think what your comment makes me think about is workforce planning in general. And so in the workforce planning side of things, we think about what needs are coming up for us and what needs we already have, and kind of trying to find that delta
Yeah.
and seeing, okay, what are we missing here, and what do we need to hire for, right? And so in that space, for sure, that's all data, right? Like that is a pure data play. And you think about like, who do we have? like where are they, where are we going to put them, where, like, and then what's left and what do we need to hire for. That's how, like, that's where recruitment kind of comes in. That's how, just generally, that's the world of HR. And so I think there's going to be, like, I think, there's incredible macro trends that are happening that can tell us a lot about where the world is going. And so when you look at now the situation we're in with COVID and the incredible move, right, the incredible transformation towards digital, chances are data and sort of cybersecurity is not going anywhere, right? So more than anything, protecting our data, and sort of protecting our information and our identities and our digital lives, really, is where cybersecurity is everything. And so, I think it's fair to say that for all, like, most company CEOs, cybersecurity is the issue that keeps them up at night. Yep. Right? It's the issue they think about the most, because that's the impact is just absolutely unreal.
Yeah. And I think this, you've worded it so well, right? Is that these are our digital footprints in our personal stories. Whatever we're trying to achieve as persons right now, as individuals, as families, we're doing it entirely across a digital environment, which takes me to this important reality is that now companies and the way they position themselves from a cybersecurity perspective, it really is not just about these are the technologies that we have for identity access. These are the technologies that we have for network intrusion. It's about here are the people that we have, and these are their stories. How important is it now for cybersecurity professionals? And this is a question that's come in, rewording it just a little. How important is it now for cybersecurity professionals, especially the young folks listening to us or coming to the Career Expo, who are going to be competing in the penetration testing competition, for them to be good storytellers, to be bloggers, to have vlogs, so on and so forth? Ayesha?
So I'll tell you, a story is everything, right? And I think this is going to connect a little bit to what you were saying earlier, or the question you were asking me earlier. I don't know if I kind of got to that point, but it's, the thing is, you guys are specialists in what you do. You know it inside out, you know everything about it, right? But most of us don't. And it's the thing. And so storytelling becomes absolutely critical, because you need to help us understand what you're doing and why. Yep. So you guys are technical experts, and that's fantastic, right? Like, that's why you're hired. But how you succeed is how effective you are in your storytelling. So there's the difference, right? Like, that's exactly what I was trying to kind of allude to earlier. And I think that was earlier Ali's point too, that we have to make a jump to understand you, especially within HR and other disciplines as well, like whether it's risk management or it's just executives that may not have an idea, like they may not know the technicalities of cybersecurity. Unfortunately, the burden falls on the more technical person to explain it to the non-technical person, right? And so the burden is unfortunately on you guys to tell us. And so even in hiring, right? So a lot of our recruiters will do the research the best that they can. And not just just generally, recruiters and HR professionals will do the best that they can to understand the world that they're hiring for, but we are not specialists, right? So what we can do is get as close as possible. And a lot of times, like, candidates will tell us, right? Like, this position sounds like it's actually 3 people. So that's good feedback for us. We'll take it back, right? But the burden, unfortunately, is on you guys to tell us a little bit about how the world works, or what we need to be to be thinking about, what we need to be prioritizing. And so storytelling is how you do that. It's the best way to have a memorable impact on the audience that you're speaking to, and help them really understand the implications of what you're suggesting. You can make recommendations, but until you contextualize those recommendations, until those recommendations mean something to me as a decision maker, I don't know how to react. Absolutely. So I'll leave it at that.
And the two-way street that you've just augmented in the world of HR and recruiting and hiring is fundamentally important. I really don't mind whatever level of skill you're at, whether you're just starting in the space of cybersecurity or you've been in it for 20 to 25 years. That moment when you are interviewing or you are prospecting for a particular position is as much about that company being interviewed by you as it is you being interviewed by that company. And I really appreciate that you've emphasized that point, not once, not twice, but thrice. And I do want to take and build another lane in this little highway that you've built for us, and you're speeding through so many concepts in HR, and ask you another question, which is along the lines of you've done a lot of work unpacking data, finding where the gaps are, looking at that data to find where the next talent may be coming from. Is it from a UFT? Is it from a Durham college? 99% of the time, it is from a Durham college. Is it
Hopefully.
from York University? Wherever it is, you've unlocked a lot of that data. But you've also looked at that data to diversify your candidate pool, to sort of change the way in which your own team is reviewing the applications that they're receiving for a variety of technical positions. Can you talk to us a little bit about that journey of looking at data and unlocking insights for diversity, Aisha?
So, I mean, look, there's a lot of concept, but let me take a step back here, right? So, I look at data as history. So and analysts are essentially, we're historians in a way, right?
Yeah.
So you're looking at if a data is sort of the history, and your analysts kind of pick the data points and they say, here's the story, here's what happened. And the challenge with that is that, you know, in history, if you look at our history, especially from the perspective of inclusion,
Yeah.
it's not great, right? If you go back a few times, like there's we have in our data, in our history, we have invisible populations. We have entire pockets of people we don't even recognize, right? Because we've never collected that data to know that they're there. And so right, and that's just across the board, unfortunately. And so when we look at trying to diversify our talent pipelines, it's been a lot of work done in that space, right? Because what we've had to do is actually try and collect new data,
Yep.
because some of our old data didn't really serve us well. We just didn't even know, we didn't collect enough to know who were we speaking with, how, like, what does diversity look like in that talent pool. And so we've had to do I would say I'm impressed by the amount of work that I think the field has done to really just trying to understand, how do we capture diversity in our data? How do we understand how to diversify our pipelines? Where do we go to diversify our pipelines? And so it's been a lot of thinking done around that, and I will say that that's something I'm proud of where we are, but we've got a long way to go.
You know this very well, and I've sustained this point all throughout our conversation, is that, look, if you're not going to work with data, or a company that's making decisions without any insights from data, it really is that deer walking across the 401, right? That blinded, not knowing where it's going, and you're really just hoping that nothing happens. And I think you've underscored two very important points, is that data can have bias in it. Data can reflect certain stereotypes that you and I may not see immediately. But number two is that it is history. And as you mentioned, and as Helen Oakley, who you may know from Leading Cyber Ladies, or Kat Good from Binary Tattoo, or for that matter, Sherry Rumble from the Department of National Defense, all of whom have been my guests on the Power Hour, have always said it's history. There's a reason why we've unpacked it, and feminist literature over a period of time has kept emphasizing history and her story and other binary iterations of that and non-binary iterations of that. But Aisha, this what can happen though with when you are looking to diversify the field of cybersecurity, and we have a lot of women and non-binary folks on the Cyber Exchange platform who are part of this and getting into the field of cybersecurity. One of the dangers, though, with trying to diversify is sometimes it can become almost like a checkbox like element. Yep, we have diversity. Can you talk to us a little bit about what are the KPIs around diversity? What happens when you initiate a diverse environment? CyberX, for example, hosted a Women in Cybersecurity conference 2 days before the lockdown, downtown Toronto. Expected 500 people, 900-ish show up, all interested not just in the technicalities, but what is the impact of diversity on cybersecurity and on technical roles? Aisha, can you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, lots. Oh my God, lots there. So if I miss anything, let me know. Just kind of direct me in that. Just kind of direct me a little bit.
Sure.
So I think, the point that sort of stuck out to me the most is this checkbox thing, right?
Yeah.
And so I guess what I'll say is that we have to really, I think as a society, just kind of really expand our horizon in terms of how we think about diversity, right? So how we traditionally think about diversity has been the checkbox approach, right? Like the racial, the gender, like race, gender, that kind of stuff, and we can kind of list them off. But I think we really need to sort of change that conversation a little bit, because diversity can exist in many different forms. It can also be about diversity of thought. It can be about diversity of experience. So there's sort of like the surface diversity that I think, unfortunately we do gravitate towards because it's easy to measure.
Yeah.
And so, data has its limitations as well. It's easy to measure. So sometimes we use racial diversity or gender diversity as a proxy for diversity of thought. Like sometimes true, right? Like it can be true. But I think where you get to the real measurement of diversity, and I want to talk about, and I think it's important to highlight that diversity can be measured qualitatively and quantitatively. So I think where we measure, or where we get a sense of the true sense of diversity, is really in the interview process, because you get to more of the qualitative insights as well. You don't just leverage the numbers or the checkbox kind of thing. I think what's more important also is to understand how do our lived experiences differ? How do we think about things? And I think the reason for that, and why we need to why we do need to diversify our workforce and actually continue on that trend, is because our data has not been perfect. It will not be perfect. It's a past. It's the thing of a past. So it is what it is. Sometimes we can't change it. It is what it is. But how we can counter maybe the negative effects of the kind of data we have, or the limited data that we have, is by diversifying our workforce, because people with lived experience will probably notice, or are more likely to notice those invisible populations, right? So when I talk about invisible populations, I'm talking about the non-binary folks. First of all, easy to think about, right? Because what we've always captured, male or female, that's it. Yeah. So that's a perfect example of a large invisible population. Yeah. What we fail to capture sometimes, if you go back a few decades, women were not part of the workforce. So we have very little data on women in the workforce if you go back far enough. It's just, I think that so sometimes we try to focus on diversifying workforce as a way to counteract some of the data missing pieces.
Yep. And I think it's absolutely crucial that I tie what you've just said to a session that happened at Cyber Exchange 2.0. Cyber Exchange 2.0 had a day dedicated to women in cyber. And there was a discussion, which I believe it was with Karen Namani. She used to be at OpenText before, or was it at ICTC? I'll definitely tweet about it and give her a shout out. But she brought my attention to something about how we even talk and present technical roles has a lot of bias laden within it. And for a moment, and I was sitting at the fancy stage at the Cyber Studio when the numbers for COVID were a little down, and I thank CyberX for making some form of in-person thing happen. I remember looking at the screen going, I wonder what she's talking about. And then she said, Ali, think about it, right? We reference certain tests as penetration tests. One example, without getting too graphic. Look at the language with which we talk. Ayesha, is it true that with some of the data that you find, you're then able to go to some of these technical teams and maybe even train them in terms of frameworks around being more equitable, anti-oppression frameworks, so on and so forth?
I mean, that's something I hope that all companies do, right? I hope that every single company has some sort of diversity and sort of diversity and inclusion kind of training, something that is near and dear to something that I'm used to talking about every single day is about unconscious bias, right? And so it's never that obvious sometimes, right? Like some of these things are really kind of embedded in us before we even realize it. And so I'm hoping as well that if there are leaders kind of listening, right? So I'm hoping that you will go back to your organizations. Actually, it doesn't matter which level. Like I'm hoping that whoever, like all the listeners today, will take the opportunity to go back to your teams and think about how do we talk about unconscious bias? How do we create an environment where we are all comfortable enough to say, "Oops, I made a mistake. Actually, I was wrong about that." I think that's the real critical piece when you talk about diversity and inclusion, right? So none of us are perfect. We all have embedded bias in us, and that's okay. It's not great. It would be ideal if it wasn't, but we are all products of a society, and we're all products of some of the messaging we receive, and some of that messaging gets embedded pretty deep. And so do we take the time to think about how we might have unconscious bias in our work, in our lives, and what do we do about it? Are we comfortable enough to bring it up when we notice it? So especially for the leaders out there, I hope that you will take the opportunity to think about how you can create an environment where people can feel comfortable to bring up uncomfortable topics. This is
Yep.
very uncomfortable. This is a very uncomfortable topic if you
Yeah,
really get down to it.
absolutely.
And so I hope that is the case. And as far as my experience has been, diversity and inclusion training has been sort of foundational in everything that we do.
And I think it's absolutely critical that once you understand the diversity element in your work and you realize diversity represents not just diversity in certain biological or social constructed traits, there are other elements to diversity as well. It feeds the kind of teams that we build in security. So whether it's a different and diverse perspective in threat intelligence, a different and diverse perspective when it comes to pen testing, so many different elements of cybersecurity require that diversity because the adversaries that you're dealing with also have that kind of diverse thought. I mentioned this a lot in other places that I've spoken at, where I said when we ran the Global Cyber Olympics Games in collaboration with CyberX, City of Oshawa, town of Ajax, and Durham College, we noticed that we had teams from across Europe, from Africa, from the Middle East, so on and so forth. And yeah, you could tell that not only was there gender diversity, there was ethnic diversity as well. But when you paid attention to the dynamics of how those teams were working, you realize different leadership styles were manifesting. You realize certain characteristics were manifesting when you needed it the most. A system is under attack. Not everybody is going into aggressive mode. There's somebody who's waiting. There's somebody who's being a little more patient. All changes the posture of a company. We've got half an hour, well, actually 25 minutes. And I do want to go to another D. I mean, D for diversity, but D for design as well. And Aisha, you've played a very big role in shaping design theory and design perspectives across organizations. Now, you've played a heavy role in the fintech space, designing new technologies. You've been keeping an eye out on how these technologies need to be prepared for different adversarial attacks, for different kind of situations around compliance. Your approach to design is very unique. I'm reminded again, and I know that the crowd, a lot of people have been saying, Ali, we're waiting on your next Narcos quote. I'm not going to bring up Narcos today, although there are a lot of quotes that I could bring up. I'm going to bring up Suits. You remember that moment when, and now I forget the name of the person, but said, if you're pushed back against a wall, break that damn wall. You've been that kind of a person. You've looked for those moments when technology, when practices have been hitting against a wall. What's your approach to design, and how do you help professionals understand how they can overcome certain problems, be it in their code or be it in their day-to-day practices? Aisha?
So, one of the things for me has always been important, like it has been important in my career, personally, professionally, in every way, it is sort of accessibility, right? So I think about, and so I've had experience within legislation, right? In terms of like how do we encourage accessibility or enable accessibility through legislation, through policies, through just
Yeah.
design itself. And so I think what I encourage everybody to do is empathy, right? It's to think about empathy. It's to think about, put yourself in someone else's shoes. Like, nobody can ever, no, we can try, but we can never replicate lived experience. What people go through, what people experience, what people go through is something you can try to empathize with, but you can never really replicate, because that's their story. And so what I always encourage people is, like, if you're designing something, talk to people that are going to use this, because you would be shocked, right? It's about, again, that diversity piece. You would be shocked at how people actually end up using the product or service that you're designing.
Yep.
You think you're designing for a purpose, and how people actually end up using it could be entirely different.
Yep.
Or the need that they actually have could be entirely different from what you think you should be designing for.
Yep.
So in every chance that you get, I would encourage you, and I'm not saying that, everybody has the time to talk to 50 people or anything, but just talk to one or two people that might be that might be the right people. And I think the one design advice that always gets left behind is design for extreme users. Design for the small, like the small population, because chances are, if you can meet the need of that extreme population, chances are the rest of the system will benefit. So this is getting into more the inclusive design. This is more getting into how this is more the inclusive design side of things. Is it's all about, like, how do you design for those niche populations in a way that actually benefits the whole. If that answers it, but happy to sort of add more context or color.
Consult, communicate, and collaborate. And I think those 3 C's need to be put on a shirt, and especially when it comes to cybersecurity. Now, Ayesha, I don't recall if you've had experiences with creating campaigns around cyber awareness and cyber safety, but again, you've played some role in the fintech space in at least getting teams that you've hired to start thinking about new realities and new attack vectors, so on and so forth. I do want to talk about that a little later on. We've got about 20 minutes. And I do apologize if I'm being direct with this question, but I'm going to take you up on this aspect of stories. And you mentioned, and I was really waiting for the right moment to bring this up. I do apologize if it throws you off, and we can move on to another subject, but I bring it up respectfully. Aisha, you spoke a lot about stories. You spoke a lot about personalizing things and getting people to know the person behind the numbers. Present the numbers, make it into a, for lack of a better word, the appetizer to get them to stay for the full course. Aisha, your challenges with accessibility have been very, very personal. We've gone to school together. You faced a lot of challenges, and at the time we were at York University, and a lot of work was done, and a lot was listened to, because of your leadership. Tell the audience a little bit about what your lived reality is and how you've had to, in a technology driven space, still had to advocate for enhanced accessibility technologies. Aisha?
Yeah, sure. So, I have a physical disability. I use a wheelchair in, like, a regular day life. In some ways, I am lucky because I don't, because now we're in a world where it's mostly digital. So I still feel, I still have access in a way that I can actually reach out and do what I need to do. I can complete the activities of my daily living in that sense. But, I'm always reminded of other people that actually have disabilities that might be sensory. So they might not be able to see the video that we're presenting right now. And so they might be listening instead, or they're seeing it, but they're not able to hear it. And so what I am always, so, it's been a strong, so I've just, because I know what it's like to face physical barriers, I can already, my lived experience helps me empathize with more of the sensory barriers and the digital barriers that are in our world. So I always keep an eye out. And I think that it's, and I think there's more, accessibility is more than just disability. Accessibility could be about income and whether you have access to Wi-Fi. Like, maybe you just don't even have access to Wi-Fi. So there's so many ways that we all kind of face barriers. And so inclusive design has been always sort of near and dear to my heart. And I guess what I'll point out to you is that so the audience here, mostly cybersecurity professionals and sort of tech professionals, you guys are the architects of our world. right? Like the new world that we're in, you are the architects, you are creating it. So you have the power to include or exclude somebody. And so it does not matter what level of position you're in. You have incredible power. You have the
Agree.
power to change somebody's world. You have the power to enable them to achieve everything that they need to achieve, or you have the power to exclude them entirely, to make them invisible. And that's an incredible responsibility that you have. I know that's an incredible responsibility. And so what I'm asking you to do is to, in the work that you do, I'm asking you to think deeply about the type of people that you are, to be mindful and deliberate about thinking. And I think deliberate being the key word. I'm asking you to be deliberate about the choices that you make. I'm asking you to be deliberate about thinking about who you're including and excluding it, and with every choice that you make, because every choice has an impact.
I think that entire statement that you've just made, and I was waiting for the right moment, and I really hope that the audience agrees that I calculated that to some level of perfection, because I think this question around diversity, very important. How you present yourself in front of recruiters, equally important. But a subject we don't talk a lot about in the world of cyber, we talk about it in technology. But when it comes to cybersecurity, we don't necessarily talk about that accessibility piece. We may have referenced it, and I really hope that those of you who are listening, whether you're from one of the big five firms or whether you're from the CrowdStrikes, the VMwares, the Zscalers of the world, or you're a student at Durham College, U of Ottawa, whatever it is, we have a lot of listeners. I really hope that you pay attention to this aspect of when you're creating your cyber awareness program, when you're building your SOC environment, when you are hiring, when you are presenting certain scenarios. People receive information in different ways. People think in different ways. There's physical accessibility issues we need to consider, but there are other social, cultural, real accessibility issues that we need to be thinking about, especially given the kind of labor force we have in Canada with second generation, in some cases first generation, so on and so forth. And I honestly believe, and Aisha, I do hope to do this in the near future. In December, I do want to have a session around Indigenous talent and First Nations talent in the world of cybersecurity and how accessibility has factored into their participation. I'll say one thing for our crowd is that when the Career Expo happens on Thursday, you're going to hear a presentation from Contact North. And I highly recommend you pay attention to that to see how they've created learning centers in remote and rural communities and are now partnering with a variety of institutions to run cybersecurity training. So, Aisha, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so very much for being positive about the question that I asked and bringing it forward. We've got about 12 more minutes left, and I want to detour just slightly away from design to this question of data again. And the reason that I bring it up is because, yes, there's data for hiring, there's data for how do we create our resumes, so on and so forth. But there's also in our cybersecurity world, folks who are capturing different aspects of data in order to make decisions, right? If you had to give cybersecurity professionals a couple of tips on how to gather their data, not technical, but just operational skill sets, what are some three tips that you would give them?
So I think, what people underestimate is where you place the collection agent, right? Like, I'll call it
Yeah.
collection agent. Like, where.
That's actually technically a very sound term. Cybersecurity professionals in the world looking to hire. Aisha is your data person. That the word agent, you just have to graduate into saying logs and beats, and that's it. You're ready to run
Two
a
more
threat
terms, right?
intelligence farm
Two
now.
more terms, and I check all the boxes.
Go ahead, Aisha.
Yeah. So it's I think, an an element that doesn't get enough attention is really like, where are you collecting your data? Because you can, so if you're going to try and collect to the best of your ability a data set that really encompasses the full, the richness of the picture, you kind of have to think from the beginning, right? So really sequential, because bias creeps in pretty early. Bias creeps in the questions you're asking. So always try to do, or the type of data even that you're looking to collect, where you collect it, why you're collecting it, what are you going to do after that. In all of this, what I haven't done a really good job of mentioning is also privacy and ethics around what you're collecting. And so I don't want to, I don't want to, I don't want to miss that. I think that's really important. It's even before you get to a point of like, I'm going to collect data, think about what you're collecting and why. Like, do you need to collect it? Maybe you don't, right? And so be very diligent. Like, you have to be able to kind of defend that decision. And I say this not just like, so it's about the right thing to do, but you could also have like some very real like regulatory sort of impact to that, right? So think about the impact of GDPR in Europe about what you're collecting, and there's some, I can't get into that right now, but there's impact there too. But really think about, do you need to collect that data? If you do, know why are you collecting that data? What are you going to do with it? Think about the outcome. What are you trying to achieve with that? And then think about, where can you get the most, like, where can you place that instrument to collect data from the most diverse sources possible? Sometimes we have, and I've seen it in myself, like I'll call out my own bias. Sometimes I go with the sources that seem the most likely. So I'm like, oh, I'm most likely to get data from here, and I'll go over there because I know these people and I can get them to put this or send this out or whatever. Yeah. And it's the path of least resistance. That's what we do. It's okay that we can acknowledge that. And so I challenge that within myself. I know that that's the path of least resistance. So I say, okay, well, what are the sources that I haven't thought about yet? And so if I have to do a Google search to get there, if I have to talk to somebody else to tell me like where else can I go to get that data set so it's the most complete possible, those are some of the tips I would say early.
Fantastic. Ayesha, we got another few minutes, and I do want to take in one more question, and then I'm going to sort of weave us through to it towards the end in our conclusion. And with items like the Career Expo coming up, with all of these different sessions, part of Cybersecurity Awareness Month, post Cybersecurity Awareness Month as well, that are coming up, the reality now is that especially for our technical folks, especially more so for our cybersecurity professionals, is that in-person ain't happening. In the green room, you mentioned to me that during the pandemic, you shifted positions from one institution, I think it was Scotia, and then you moved over to RBC, whatever that may be. You did it entirely online. You interviewed online. You did everything virtually. Any tips that you can give for folks in terms of how they present themselves when they are virtually being interviewed by an Ayesha Zubair?
Well, if I were that lucky, right? I would feel very lucky if I had an opportunity to talk to some of your folks. But I switched departments, right? So I was still within the same organization, but I switched departments, and it's a big place. So sometimes I actually didn't know some of the folks that I would be working with, and it was a very weird experience because you're so used to seeing people in person. And so I would say, and this is very technical, like tactical stuff, but sometimes you notice things like lighting, right? Like I want to be able to see you. And it becomes, when you're in a virtual environment, it becomes even more important to have some of those background lighting, all of that stuff in a good place. Be comfortable. I think how comfortable you feel shows, right? So if you're in a comfortable environment, where you are, you're happy with where you are, you're not worried about, anything, like you're not, your pets are fed, they're good to go, all that kind of stuff, like all those little things. Do whatever you can to kind of take some of those other intrusive thoughts that might come in your mind, take them out of the picture. Do what you can to prepare for that, because I think in a virtual environment it becomes even more important to have presence, to be entirely where you are, right? So presence shows, authenticity shows. That authenticity hasn't changed. I don't think that's a different thing, but I think presence
shows more.
Presence is I think the biggest thing that I would say to you.
I think it shows more, it's pronounced more. In another session that I was doing with Janet Sai from the US, and then with Abbas Kudrati from Australia, who's one of the leads in cybersecurity for Microsoft down there, is he mentioned this aspect of consistency as well, right? And when you come to work, for example, there's a consistent flow that you follow, right? You have an 8 a.m. team meeting, an 8:30 p.m. powwow, whatever it may be. To maintain that consistency online, and to do it in a genuine way, and to do it in a way which is respectful of the fact that, things happen when people are meeting at home, so on and so forth. It requires a certain set of leadership, but it also, if ever there was a time when the statement "the world is your stage" has ever been a reality, it is today. And that Shakespearean moment is now, and that reality is now. Aisha, we are coming very close to the conclusion. We've got about 5 more minutes. And what I always like to do is, before I thank our guests and meet them in the green room and wish them adieu, I always like to close off with a couple of interesting moments in people's careers, but also to get an insight into what books do they read, so on and so forth. Now, to our audience, you all know that me and Aisha went to school together, York University. Shout out to them. I ended up graduating. Aisha says she graduated. I believe she did.
We don't know. It's a mystery.
Earlier, I started off by saying you doubted if I graduated, and I turned that around. But Aisha, I wanted to ask you what books have influenced you. But before I do that, I actually wanted to bring up a book that we read during our school days, and it's called "In Spite of the Gods." And this is a story about India's mercurial growth in the technology sector. And the reason I bring this book up is, besides the fact that I read it back and forth a million times, well, a couple of times, the reason I bring it up is because I still remember there was a quote in the introduction from Rabindranath Tagore, which I think I followed very closely. And that was the statement where he said, to the outside world, our civilization, referring to the subcontinent, always may seem metaphysical and nothing more than that. Just like to a deaf and mute person, your fingers on a piano may be nothing more than mechanical movements. And what he was implying there is that know the unknowns within yourself. Know that there is more. Know that, as you just said, bad or a bad situation is a good opportunity to build something new and to build what's next. What books, Aisha, have influenced you in your career?
Well, I think there's a book called Scarcity,
Mm-hmm.
and
I know that one. Yep.
yeah, it's to me that's fascinating, right? It's about how really the what's going on internally is such a driving force in our behavior.
Yep.
I'm always curious about behavior and how that works. So a lot of my reads tend to focus on that kind of stuff. So I found Scarcity a really good sort of shape. I think it kind of really shaped how I think about design too.
Yep.
There is a I've recently been reading. It's called The Silk Roads by Frankopan.
I haven't read about that. I
Yeah,
know History of the World.
history of the world, but it's
Aisha, that hasn't changed about me. I may have aged and all of that, but books and
books
me
are the
are very
same.
good friends, just to let you know and remind you.
Yeah.
Just for our audience, so me and Aisha used to be part of a couple of student clubs, and Aisha was always president. And clearly, she made the best hiring choice ever. But, anyways, I'll leave that there. Carry on, Aisha. The Silk Route.
Yeah, and the reason I like the Silk Roads is because a lot of the history that we read, um a lot of the things we talk about are really they're from a particular perspective. And so that kind of helped me sort of shift my perspective. It made me realize, like you said, right, my unknowns. It made me very aware of it. I didn't know what my unknowns are. I don't know still. I'm still discovering that. But I think that it made me just very aware that there are unknowns, and I think that's an important realization. um, on the more Canadian like fiction side of things, there's something called the Deptford trilogy by a Canadian, and so the Deptford trilogy, the interesting thing is it's the same story. There's three books, it's
Yep.
the same story, but it's from three different perspectives.
Yep.
And that to me, like that was my I read this in high school. I read that in high school, and it to me it still resonates, right? Like I still think about that every single day. Because it was amazing how you got three different books out of the same story, the same storyline. So yeah, I think I'll those are sort of the three main ones that really I've enjoyed also work from Yuval Noah Harari. He
Yes.
talks a lot about the
David.
civilization and that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. So that's usually my MO.
Yeah, you know what, Aisha? I know you mentioned that you've not been directly involved in cybersecurity, but at the peripheries. But I will tell you one thing, and I'm sure our audience concurs that some of the books that you've referenced, Sapiens as an example, right? are books that many other professionals have referenced as well. And I think it's so crucial, so fundamental to realize this and the parallels that you have, because when I said people, process, technology at the start, I meant it in that order. If you can get the people piece as a work in progress, perfected to some degree, process and technology will follow. And I think it's so important to realize that with books, it's a great way to travel without moving, but more importantly, it's a great way to look at that diversity and to look for that diversity. Ayesha, I know you have other places to be. I am going to bring this conversation to a conclusion now by making some closing remarks and then waiting for you in the green room and bidding you adieu as well. To our audience, there's another jam packed week of cybersecurity events coming your way starting next week. November 5th, the Career Expo. November 6th, the opening of the CPTC. November 7th, the actual CPTC Games. Then from November 9th to 13th, the Canadian CISO Forum. Right after that is the Intercontinental CISO Forum as well, where we'll have leaders from Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and the subcontinent, all discussing a variety of issues related to cybersecurity. And I'm honored and thankful that my team at Durham College gets to partner in many of these events. And a major shout out to the folks at Ajax for making all of this happen. You know, if you learned anything from today's discussions, I'm sure you learned a lot. But let it be this. I've often said this in my classroom that communication, collaboration, consulting is all part of that successful toolkit of a good cybersecurity practitioner. But I've also said that when you're speaking, or let me rephrase that a little bit, often you'll find yourself speaking with everybody hearing you, but you'll often find yourself speaking with nobody listening. The point is, it's all good to be physically present. It's about listening to someone with that mental awareness. It's about listening to someone wholeheartedly. Knowing how to present your story, knowing how to capture an audience really is a skill set that you don't necessarily learn in code, but it's something that you learn in your day to day interactions. And as Aisha correctly pointed out, with the hyper virtualization that we're expected to be in for a very, very long time, COVID or no COVID, knowing how to capture an audience's attention is fundamental to your success and to your growth in the industry. I've said this before and I'll say it again. If there's anything that I learned from Ayesha Zubair today, it is the fact that don't just show me what you can build it and show it to me. Come with your data and then tell me the story. Don't just tell me the story of your data alone. Ayesha, with that, I want to thank you for your time. I'm going to ask you to wait so that I can talk to you once more in the green room. I want to thank our audience. And Ayesha, I'll turn it over to you to say goodbye to our audience, and then we'll take it from there. Ayesha?
Well, look, thanks so much for having me. Thank you for taking the time out of your day or night or evening, wherever you may be, for joining us and listening today. If you have, I'm always, if you need to reach out, I'm always here. Please feel free to. It's been such a pleasure. I know you guys are talented professionals, and so I'm looking forward to seeing all the wonderful things that you accomplish. I said it before, and I'll say it again. You have a really great responsibility on your hands, and I'm very fortunate to have had the opportunity to talk to you today. I hope that you are creating our world, like I said earlier, and so I'm looking forward to what a wonderful world it's going to be if you're here and listening to all sorts of different perspectives. Thanks for your
Aisha,
time.
Aisha, thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody. Have a safe weekend, and we'll all see you next week. Take care and good day.